Want to use a PGR in your cereals but have no time for a separate pass? Manipulator PGR can be applied as early as one tiller. Just add it to your herbicide to reduce lodging, increase harvest efficiency, and maximize yields. Talk to your retailer for more info and to confirm acceptable tank mixes.
I'm Shaun Haney, and this is RealAg on the Weekend. Let's get real and get connected with the week that was in Canadian agriculture. RealAg on the Weekend starts now. Welcome, everybody, to RealAg on the Weekend here, of course, on 650 CKOM and 980 CJME. I'm your host, Shaun Haney of RealAgriculture.com. Hope you had yourself a great week. It is great to be with you. Today, we're going to break down a number of really, really cool discussions that myself and the editorial team had throughout the week at RealAgriculture.com. And, of course, it's hard to believe we are in the back end of April. Next week, it is May. My goodness, time is really flying. This calendar just continues to just flip and spiral. And just the year is just blowing by us. Today on the show, we're going to hear from Dr. Charles Geddes. He is with AFC out of Lethbridge. We're going to talk about Kochia and some Kochia survey results that you really, I'll be a bit of a preview. It continued to show that Kochia is a menace on the Western Canadian prairies, especially from a herbicide resistance standpoint that makes this weed even worse. We're also I'm going to give you some data relative to how Canadian farmers feel about the impact of biofuel policy on their farming operations. Some interesting stuff there to pull out, especially when we look at Eastern versus Western Canada. We're also going to have a market update from John Driedger of LeftField Commodity Research out of Winnipeg, Manitoba. And then we're also going to hear, we're going to have a Canola School. We're going to talk about flea beetles, because I know that when we think about canola and emergence and some of the challenges early on, of course, cold weather is a factor, but the menace really is flea beetles. So we're going to talk about that today as well. Hey, if you have any feedback on today's show, I'd love to hear from you. Send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. You can also find us across all the different social media platforms or call that RealAg feedback line, 855-776-6147. Let's hear my conversation with Charles Geddes talking about Kochia.
So Kochia is, traditionally it's been an issue for farmers on the southern Canadian prairies, especially in some of the drier regions like southern Saskatchewan, southern Alberta. More recently, we've been seeing Kochia becoming more of an issue for farmers, even starting to move further north now into sort of central Alberta, central Saskatchewan, and also into Manitoba as well. So the range of Kochia seems to be expanding, and it's moving its way further north than it has occurred in the past. Part of that is due to the biology of the plant, and the other part is due to herbicide resistance and the different types of herbicide resistance that we see in Kochia on the Canadian prairies.
So when you talk about the plant evolving, well, just park resistance for a second. Is it becoming more accustomed to different climates instead of just thriving in the dryness of, say, a southern Alberta?
Kochia, it's widely adaptable to a lot of different environmental conditions. Part of the limitation of its range in the past was related to the requirement for growing degree days for seed production. So it's hard to say if the plant is actually evolving so that requirement is I guess looser than it was in the past, or perhaps more likely is the impact that we've been having from weather patterns on the prairies as of late, right? So warmer summers resulting in greater accumulation of growing degree days further north, allowing this plant to essentially go to seed further north than it has in the past.
Now, you mentioned herbicide resistance. Of course, glyphosate is one of those components, but it's not limited to glyphosate. We've got resistance in some other chemistries as well.
Yeah, that's right. So we know that in Kochia can exhibit resistance to up to 5 different herbicide modes of action. And 4 of those have been identified in populations present on the Canadian prairies. So we're talking about, first of all, groups 2, herbicide groups 2, which would be the ALS inhibitors, group 4, which would be the auxin mimics, group 9, which would be glyphosate, and group 14, which are the PPO inhibitors. All four of those we know to occur on the Canadian prairies. And then there's also resistance to group 5 or photosystem 2 inhibitors that is present in the United States. And we don't know it to occur in Western Canada, but that's simply because that's really not where our resistance testing efforts have focused in the past.
And what is it about the kochia plant that makes it more susceptible to resistance, or I'm not sure the right word to use there, but resistance comes easy to kochia?
Yeah, it's certainly prone to the evolution of herbicide resistance. Part of that is related to the wide genetic variability that you see in kochia that helps predispose it to mutations that may confer herbicide resistance. Another part of it is related to the biology of the plant and how resistance spreads. So it has a type of flowering. It's called protogynous flowering, which means that the female part of the flower becomes receptive to pollen before the male part of the flower fully develops. And that creates an initial period of forced outcrossing. And along with the outcrossing through pollen comes transfer of herbicide resistance traits. So we see transfer of herbicide resistance through outcrossing, but we also see spread of herbicide resistance through seed as well, because it's a tumbleweed and can spread its seed across multiple fields in the same year.
Yeah, if you do see those tumbleweeds flying across the road, there's a good chance that it was a kochia plant not exactly taken care of when it should have been taken care of. It's also a weed that I think of in terms of coming in flushes. Like it's not just like kind of one round of kochia and once you take care of it, we're good, right? They seem to keep on coming. Is that a factor in this?
Yeah, well, so that can be part of it as well, right? So what you're talking about is the phenology of emergence, right? And kochia is one of the first weed species to emerge in fields in the spring, right? So we're sitting here at the beginning of April, and we about a month ago we saw the first kochia populations emerge, at least that we were looking for anyway, on the prairies, right? So it definitely emerges early, but it can emerge in multiple flushes as well that are usually associated with precipitation events. So you can see kochia flushing even after you're applying a herbicide meant to control that population. So it's pretty difficult to catch the entire kochia population with a single weed control pass.
I don't know if there's an official ranking out there of weed resistant weeds. Everyone always talks about Palmer amaranth as like, the mecca, the king of, that's the one you really want to make sure you never have to deal with. Where does kochia fit? Talk about that.
Yeah, so there's not really an official ranking out there, but there's certainly problematic weeds depending on the geographical location and cropping systems that are practiced, right? So what the United States is seeing with Palmer amaranth and water hemp currently on the prairies, kochia is kind of like our Palmer amaranth and water hemp right now, right? Where it is quickly becoming one of our biggest weed issues that farmers are dealing with.
And one of the challenges here too is that a control strategy just based on herbicides feels like that's becoming more and more, or it maybe is now a losing proposition. Management is changing and evolving, just like the weed is.
Yeah, that's right. As you start to see the stacking of traits that confer resistance to different herbicide modes of action, that pool of available herbicides becomes more and more limited, right? And you have less options in that toolbox. And what a lot of our research is suggesting, once you start getting multiple resistance in kochia, it's very difficult to get ahead of the issue just through a herbicide management strategy, right? So you need to be adding in other tools on top of that, other non-chemical techniques targeting kochia.
As you look at the years of survey results that you have related to kochia, and then you extrapolate what you're seeing in some of the trends, and then you maybe with you're a research scientist, so you're very much in this. Where is this headed?
Yeah,
Have
for
your
sure.
thoughts on that?
So I guess first of all, one of the projects that we lead and collaborate on across the prairies is it's the Kochia surveys, right? So it's a post-harvest survey of Kochia, collect different weed samples and test them for herbicide resistance. And what we do with Kochia is we collect samples from the field, bring them back to controlled environment, and screen them with different herbicides. So we focus in the past. There's been a lot of screening on group 2 herbicides, but we've actually stopped screening with group 2 because recent results suggest that essentially all kochia populations on the prairies have some level of group 2 resistance. Glyphosate is another main one, where our surveys between 2018 and 2021 that covered the entire prairie region, close to 900 samples, showed that just under 3/4 of those samples have some level of glyphosate resistance. And in addition, just under 1/4 of the samples had dicamba resistance, which is a synthetic auxin or a group 4 herbicide. Some of our other research is focused on fluroxypyr resistance, which is another commonly used group 4 herbicide, showing that fluroxypyr resistance was in 44% of the samples that we tested from Alberta. We only focused on Alberta for the fluroxypyr screening. And more recently, we've identified PPO inhibitor resistance or group 14 resistance in 2 kochia samples from the Canadian prairies. One was sort of in west central Saskatchewan, and the other one was in southern Alberta.
That was Charles Geddes of AFC out of Lethbridge, Alberta, research scientist there at the research station. Dr. Charles Geddes, great work there, important data. And of course, kochia, if you have it, you know it, and the geography continues to spread. Definitely a yield robber when it comes to Western Canadian agriculture. If you want more information on that discussion, go to RealAgriculture.com. When we come back, we're going to talk about biofuel policy and the impact on Canadian farmers. You're listening to RealAg on the Weekend here on 650 CKOM, 980 CJME.
If you're involved in the agriculture industry, it's important to stay informed on all the latest issues affecting your business. At RealAgriculture.com, we offer fast, reliable news, information, and insights to help you keep on top of all of the latest in Canadian agriculture. Visit RealAgriculture.com and sign up for our free daily newsletter covering everything from news, agronomy, animal agriculture, and much more. Visit RealAgriculture.com/subscribe today.
There's a reason we call it the Corn School. Videos on everything from planter setup to weed control, field trial results, and the latest yield strategies. The Corn School on RealAgriculture.com has the information and advice you need to help you succeed. Brought to you by Pride Seeds and BASF. Corn School episodes are available at cornschool.com, from RealAgriculture.com, or as a podcast in your favorite podcast app. Check out the latest Corn School episode today.
Want to use a PGR in your cereals but no time for a separate pass? Manipulator PGR can be applied as early as 1 tiller. Just add it to your herbicide to reduce lodging risk, increase harvest efficiency, and maximize yields. Talk to your retailer for more info and to confirm acceptable tank mixes.
Okay, let's talk about biofuels. And I have always said in a lot of my speeches that there is a difference in terms of how biofuels resonate in the farming community in Canada versus the U.S. And especially in the Midwest, when it comes to ethanol, farmers very, very pro-ethanol in a vast majority. In Canada, I've never really got the same kind of love for the opportunity of biofuels. There's differing points of view is maybe the best way to put it. So in January, we had asked farmers through RealAgristudies, how do they see biofuels and the clean fuel regulation in Canada? Is it a positive on your business or is it a negative on your business? And the data or the information and the responses are kind of fascinating and kind of confirm sort of what I had a feel for in terms of the reaction. So Let's look a little deeper here for sure. So, okay, we have basically have 35% of Canadian farmers saying it actually has a negative impact on my business. 14% of that being very negative. Only 10% of respondents said very positive impact. 32% were slightly positive impact. And there was 24%, so essentially a quarter of the sample said, I'm not really sure. So let's dig into what does that actually mean. When we index it and we look at -2 being the most negative, +2 being the most positive, farmers are actually neutral. It's 0.01. You can't get any closer to zero. Farmers in Canada are neutral on the benefit to their farm businesses when it comes to biofuels and the clean fuel standard. So are there groups inside of that sample that answered in January that are a little bit more negative or positive than some of the others? Here's again what we found. When it comes to livestock producers, they were actually the most negative, which you would maybe expect because there is an assumption or a thought out there that, hey, more demand for crops to go into biofuels is more demand that I have to compete with when it comes to feeding my livestock. Primarily crop growers, though, only a 0.16. So kind of sort of positive, not really. Crop farmers being fairly close to neutral. It's both crops and livestock that actually were just slightly negative as well. So the livestock producer definitely holding that ground there at -0.53. Now, when we look at some of the other groups here, okay, so if we look at it by farm size, for example, what we find is that the smallest growers, the most negative impact, so -0.52, remember, -2 most negative, +2 the most positive. And it's the smallest farmers that are essentially saying that, hey, I'm the most negatively impacted here. Interesting enough, the larger farmers also in the negative. The most positive were farmers between 2.5 and 5 million in farm revenues. Also positive were the farmers between 1 million and 2.5, and farmers between 500 and 1 million in revenue. We'll skip over acres because this is national. Let's look at age as a factor. Okay, so if we look at it from the standpoint, age is a factor in how you feel about biofuels. The younger you are, the more positive you are on biofuels and the impact. The older you are, the more negative you are. Okay, so if you were 45 and over, you felt that biofuels were a slight negative impact on your farming business. If you were basically 44 and younger, you felt it was a positive on your farm business, and actually under 35 being the most positive at a 0.57 out of 2. Let's look at it from the standpoint of region. Now, here's the surprise. So and I have tested this on a lot of people. If I was to ask, who do you think would be the most positive about biofuels and the clean fuel standard in Canada? The West or the East? Most people say the same thing to me. Shaun, it's East. That's where the corn's grown. They got the most developed ethanol industry. It's going to be the East. It's a little bit more ingrained. You're also going to get the Midwest effect moving north. It's got to be the East. It's actually wrong. Western Canadian farmers, slightly positive. Okay? Western Canadian farmers, slightly positive. Eastern Canadian farmers, slightly negative. It's actually the reverse. Now, both of these are fairly close to neutral. Okay? We've got Western Canadian farmers at 0.08, and we've got Eastern Canadian farmers at -0.13. So we're talking the slightest of margins here, but it's the opposite of what one would think. If you want to hear about this data or other research projects that RealAgristudies has done, go to RealAgristudies.com. We'll be right back here on RealAg on the Weekend on 650 CKOM and 980 CGME right after this. Get all the information you need to keep your pulse crop healthy and profitable with the Pulse School on RealAgriculture.com. The Pulse School is a free YouTube video series covering agronomy, research, and more across a host of different pulse crops. It's also available as an audio podcast wherever you download or stream your favorite podcasts. Check us out on YouTube or visit RealAgriculture.com. The Pulse School, brought to you by BSF Canada.
The Canola School on RealAgriculture.com is your one-stop shop for everything a canola grower needs. Check out our free video series on YouTube for all the latest in canola agronomy, research, marketing, and more. Don't have time to watch? Download the podcast version of the Canola School on RealAgriculture.com or anywhere you download your podcasts. Stay on top of all things canola with the Canola School on RealAgriculture.com, brought to you by BASF and Invigor Hybrid Canola.
And welcome back to RealAg on the Weekend. I'm your host, Shaun Haney of RealAgriculture.com. The markets have definitely been in a bit of a slide, slippity slide, as that song goes. It really kind of locked in a channel. I wanted to address this and what your marketing strategy should look like to deal with it as we head into 2024 seeding time. Talk to John Driedger of LeftField Commodity Research. John, what's with this sideways trade?
No, that's very true, Shaun. And in some ways, and to kind of overgeneralize, of course, every crop has its own story and so on. But I think by and large, for most of these markets, I could see us kind of going through a window here where we spend time trading in a range. We have been actually for a while in a lot of cases for the last few months or maybe longer, depending on the market, where, as you mentioned, like well off of the highs of the previous couple of years. And I think, just to pause there for 1 second, I mean, I think sometimes we forget just how unusual all the different circumstances were that collided at the same time to cause prices to go to those incredible levels. War in Ukraine, drought in Western Canada, COVID, all those dynamics, all that stuff has worked itself out. Now we're kind of well off of those highs, but also as much as, sentiment feels negative in a lot of ways about the markets, we're still maintaining levels that are above what would have been considered actually pretty good levels pre-2020. And so depending again on the futures market, we maybe, whereas previously we'd been bumping up against resistance levels, that's the new support. And so, in a lot of these cases, again, we've been trading in those ranges maybe for a little while or setting up to kind of continue to trade in those ranges. And I think a case could be made that, barring, either perfect weather or multiple things stacking up one way or the other, we could spend some time drifting in a range that is, again, disappointing in the context of recent memory, and yet also from a longer term historical perspective, actually pretty good values. And we may just spend some time there, again, depending on how things shake out with weather and conditions and yields and so on.
Well, again, let's just use it as an example. September spring week, okay? Right now, we're around that 6.5. If you look at April of 2020, before the big run up, we're looking at a 5 spot. We're $1.50 higher now. We also were at $14 at a very brief moment in 2022, so we're a lot closer to the bottom than we are the top. But still, if you look at the recent trade in a lot of these commodities, one, less volatility than there was during going through the pandemic, or coming out of the pandemic, I should say, and more, we're definitely in a sideways trade. We're not in this conclusive like hockey stick up or the big drop down. Is that fair?
Yeah, no, I think that is fair, Shaun, and I think you could make that case. I mean, looking at the charts, as you mentioned, you could look at whether you look at a long-term corn chart, you look at canola, those sorts of things. Again, similar-ish type of behavior, but I think also from a fundamental perspective, in a lot of cases, and if we want to talk about something like canola, certainly the market is not anywhere as tight as it was, again, going back, the previous couple of years. And yet, we got all this crush capacity coming online. Crush demand is increasing. Stocks are not that large. Depending what yields look like this coming year, we're not going to have like a massive canola crop. And so that kind of helps lend itself to provide some support. And yet stocks are comfortable enough globally in Canada. Export demand has been soft to a lot of markets. That puts a ceiling. And so we kind of make time in a range. And in some of these markets, whether it's corn or some others, you get to the bottom of that range, all of a sudden, maybe farmer selling dries up. You unlock some fresh demand. You kind of rebound off the lows a little bit, and then you kind of, rally. And yet at a certain point, it kind of stalls out. Farmer selling picks up, maybe supplies are comfortable enough, that sort of thing. And it feels like there's sort of factors that sort of box us in either way from allowing us to kind of break too low or grab too much of a run. And so again, it just kind of lends itself to kind of moving in this range back and forth here. And as I mentioned, obviously we got the most important weather ahead of us, so all sorts of scenarios could play out. But calling, say, average-ish type of weather or that sort of thing, we could potentially see this kind of a scenario here for quite some time, quite possibly.
Would you call what we're experiencing here coming out of the first 4 months of the year? Have we established, and I hate to call this, but have we established a bottom? I've got my fingers crossed as I say that.
Yeah.
I just want to let you know.
Yeah, no, I guess I'd put it this way, Shaun. Like, your resolve on that thesis is always tested when you start flirting with those support levels, and so I was always a little reluctant, kind of pound my fist on the table, saying, yeah, absolutely, this is the bottom. But again, you look at something like, say, corn futures, sort of holding that 410-ish, for example, from a long-term chart perspective. I think that was kind of pretty important, and you look back over a long period of time, and that has acted as a level of resistance. So that might naturally be a place where we held some support, and we did, and recently, soybean futures had held some support, soy oil, a couple of those markets. Again, if all of a sudden yields line up, we have a bumper crop, those levels, of course, become vulnerable. But there seems to be, at least as of now, some support at those levels. Again, you start unlocking some demand. Maybe it starts getting a little quote unquote too cheap per se. Maybe they've sucked out a little bit too much weather premium given where we're at in the calendar. And so again, your resolve always gets tested when you start flirting with those levels. But so far they have held, and we would have a bias that they hold anyway, if you will. Again, just being an analyst, you're humble enough to know that things happen that you can't foresee with perfect clarity. But that's
fortune teller.
That's how I would view it.
Yeah, you're not a fortune teller.
No, we kind of think of ourselves, and Chuck always describes as well. We're more do reconnaissance rather than prediction per se. And that's maybe a more accurate way of putting it. We know what we don't know, and we try and be honest and acknowledge that, even as we kind of project out kind of what we think are some different scenarios and so on. It's all about probabilities, really.
Yeah. So if I think back to the last 6 months, okay. I would say the high majority of the analysts that we've done interviews with, the strategy suggestion has been sell into the rallies. Is in your mind, is it still that kind of a market right now?
Yeah, honestly, I believe so, Shaun. It's one of those, and again, for sort of trading in a kind of a range, which again would be sort of our base scenario or our more likely scenario. We're reluctant to chase it lower when the market breaks. But at the same time, if someone's behind where they want to be at sales wise, old crop, new crop, whatever it is, use these rallies to do some catching up. The phrase I use is maybe a little bit of an itchy trigger finger. Do you need to, kind of sweep the bins and sell all of next year's crop because we tacked 15 cents in the market? No. Do you want to be taking advantage of rallies? Yeah, I think so. Because again, I think from a fundamental perspective, unless we start losing significant production and yield in some key growing areas, which could happen, but until that kind of starts to become a little more imminent rather than just a what if, I think these rallies are opportunities to do some catching up. Because at the end of the day, if we have, normal-ish type of a production scenario in a lot of these key regions, well, supplies are going to be comfortable enough that, well, those rallies probably are going to be pretty good opportunities we slide back down. So that's kind of our base scenario. And again, every crop sort of has its own nuances, but I think until Mother Nature tells us otherwise, I think that's the stance we sort of got to be working from.
That was John Driedger of LeftField Commodity Research. If you want to hear the full discussion with John, you can check out the RealAg Radio podcast or go to RealAgriculture.com. We'll be back because we're going to talk about flea beetles right after this. You're listening to 650 CKOM 980 CGME. It's RealAg on the Weekend.
I'm Lindsay Smith from RealAgriculture.com. Join me Monday nights for The Agronomists, a 1-hour live and interactive show broadcast across YouTube, Facebook, and X. Monday nights at 8 p.m. Eastern, I host expert agronomists from all over the country to give you answers to some of the toughest agronomic questions. Join us live or catch the replay Tuesday morning. That's The Agronomist with me, Lindsay Smith, Monday nights live at 8 p.m. Eastern.
Hi, I'm Bernard Tobin, host of the Soybean School on RealAgriculture.com. Throughout the year, on the Soybean School, we'll bring you timely agronomic video content from planting to harvest, from the latest agronomic research to the latest in production technology. Check out our massive video library on YouTube, RealAgriculture.com, or download the audio podcast versions wherever you get your podcasts. The Soybean School is brought to you by BASF and Syngenta Canada.
One of the things that we do at RealAgriculture.com is a series of crop schools. One of those is the Canola School. You can find the episodes at canolaschool.com, and it's brought to you by BASF and Invigor Hybrid Canola. And in a recent episode, Kelvin Hepner of Real Agriculture had a chance to catch up with Keith Gabert. He is with the Canola Council of Canada to talk about flea beetles.
Well, the important thing that growers instinctively know about flea beetles is that we can't predict them. So your best defense against flea beetles is to put enough seed in the ground, get an adequate plant stand established, get that plant stand that is there growing vigorously, and to get through that stage where you've got some possibility of having issues with flea beetles. If you can get to 3 or 4 leaves by 3 to 4 weeks, which rolls off the tongue really well, but to actually get 3 leaves in 4 weeks is a bit of a struggle. You've got a nice growing crop if things pop out of the ground and 21 to 28 days later have 3 or 4 nicely established leaves. But that's the key point where we need to protect that crop and get it well established. We'll have flea beetles. If you have flea beetles chewing on small cotyledons, they can do a lot of damage in a hurry.
So with 3 to 4 leaves by that point, how many plants taking it a step back?
So our recommendation is 5 to 8 plants per square foot. The joke is, I shouldn't say it's a joke, but the saying is that leaves you some room for a few to get lost to frost, or maybe some cutworms come through, or maybe you've got some trash or some crusting or something that might cause you to lose some of those plants. So it depends on the grower. If that means you've got to put 10 seeds in the ground to get 5 to 8 plants up and growing, that's fine. If it means you need to put 14 or more seeds in the ground per square foot, that's something that we'd like each grower to know about their seeder, because sitting here and talking to you pre-season, I really don't know anything about the seed drill that they're going to take their seed and put it in the ground with.
What are the special considerations in a dry year, such as this one is shaping up to be again here, Keith, in many areas?
So we'd actually like you to take pretty much the same preceding checklist or precautions in a dry year as most years, because we often don't really know what the story will be. But there are some sort of to lookouts. We understand that your seed place fertilizer is more likely to spend a little more time in contact with the seed, not likely to dissipate and move out into the soil. So only putting safe rates of phosphorus seed fertilizer in with the row is a standard recommendation, but it comes really critical in a dry year. And one of the tests that we'll sometimes ask growers to do is just shut off their seed place fertilizer as they're traveling through the field seeding. In 1 or 2 spots where you'll notice, but maybe the neighbors won't, shut off your seed place fertilizer. Remember to turn it back on. And if your crop looks better the first 3 or 4 weeks, you're obviously doing something wrong with your seed place fertilizer. So there's a quick and easy check, a little toggle switch in the cab that will let you do that. And seed place fertilizer is one of those things that really can do a lot of damage, but most growers are thinking that they're safe, and they just maybe should prove it to themselves once in a while.
Yeah, especially in a dry year. And again, this will depend on your setup in how your equipment works and where that fertilizer is going relative to the seed. But what's the rule of thumb? 20 pounds per acre for phosphorus?
Yeah, it's a slight difference in the provincial recommendations, but we say 20 pounds of actual phosphorus, so 40 pounds of 1152 per acre down with the seed. Don't want to put your sulfur there. Don't want to put urea there. Some of the coated products coated particle coated urea, or ESN, is actually really safe there. But no reason to really stick it in there. Stick with your safe rate of 1152 and keep moving forward.
So finally then, Keith, if we're trying to get these plants to that 3 to 4 leaf stage by 3 to 4 weeks, what about planting timing and soil temperature? Should we be seeding later into warmer soils? It's something that I know a lot of growers have wrestled with that over the last number of years as well. Right. So we talk about seeding into a warm, moist seed bed, and that's one of those standard textbook things that will tell you. It's really important for a small seeded crop like canola to do a good job of seed placement, get really good seed to soil contact, make sure your packing's working in your favor. But putting it too deep tends to delay emergence and reduces your emergence percentage. So seeding deep is just a bad idea. Seeding too early is typically a bad idea as well. This year we have dry conditions across the majority of the prairies, so you'll have seedbed conditions that are suitable for seeding, perhaps earlier in the calendar than you might normally want to seed your canola. So two things can go wrong there. One, your soil temperature may be low, but if we've had a lot of sunny days, the soil temperature at the seeding depth actually comes up reasonably quickly. The other thing is that your calendar date might not be far enough along that you're realistically going to avoid spring frost. So with a canola seedling that puts all of its efforts up and the cotyledons and everything are exposed to the weather, if you have a frost event, that's another thing that prevents us from seeding too early. And we tend to see more rapid uniform emergence as we move later in the year, but then you run the risk of it further drying out your seed beds. So it's the same song and dance that a grower will have dealt with every season that they've put seed in the ground. And keep in mind, your seed treatment is also only active or effective for a limited amount of time too, right? Yeah. So the seed treatments, everyone's slightly different, but we generally think that there's about 4 weeks of protection there. And if you put it in too early and the crop's just basically coming out of the ground at the 3 or 4 week mark, we know that seed treatment's going to be dissipated a little bit or worn out a bit, so you're more likely to need a foliar application. And we've had growers put multiple foliar applications on, so it's kind of a really great idea to sort of plan in advance. How am I going to set this crop up for success? And if I do need a foliar application, how am I going to get how am I going to make it the most effective application that I can? So I guess it's also a reminder at this time, this is when we can also plan. You mentioned having a test strip when it comes to your seed place fertilizer, potentially if you're making changes in your seed treatment packages as well or anything along those lines. This is also something to make note of that and so that you can track that later on in the year as well. Well, absolutely. There's all sorts of things that growers will have access to or will have tried. So a different seed treatment, it'd be nice to see that side by side just so a grower has an impression of what it's done for him this season. The other thing, and it might not be the seed treatment, or there may be a different seed treatment on it. Try a different variety. It's really important to take a look at more than one canola hybrid on the farm because they change often. And if you have a concern, that comparison is invaluable when you come later in the season to say, how did I make out, and did I make a really good choice in the genetics that I put on the farm?
Lots to take into consideration there. That was Keith Gabert of the Canola Council of Canada talking to Kelvin Hepner of RealAgriculture.com. Well, that's all the time we have for today's show. If you do have any feedback, we would love, of course, to hear from you. You can send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. Find us across all the different social media platforms, or you can call that RealAg feedback line, 855-776-6147. Make sure you check out realagriculture.com. Subscribe to our e-newsletters as well at realagriculture.com/subscribe. And also download the RealAg Radio podcast. Hey, everybody, have yourself a great rest of your weekend. Good luck next week out in the fields. Thank you so much for getting real and getting connected with RealAg on the weekend.